Sera opened her eyes slowly. The first thing she felt was cold. A deep, heavy cold that pressed against her scales like stone. She lay on her side, her wings twisted beneath her, one of them bent at an angle that sent sharp pain through her back when she tried to move. She did not move for a long time. She just lay there breathing. The mountain was silent. That was the thing that broke her first. Not the pain. Not the cold. The silence. Her mountain had never been silent. There had always been something. The deep rumble of elder dragons speaking in low tones, the sharp cries of young hatchlings chasing each other through the stone corridors, the steady beat of wings high above the peaks. Sound had always lived here. The mountain had always been alive. Now there was nothing. Sera pressed her claws into the ash beneath her and pushed herself up slowly. Every part of her body protested. Her left wing was damaged, she could feel it without looking. Her side had a long cut that had dried into a dark crust overnight. Her head ached with a dull and constant pain that made the world feel slightly tilted. She sat up anyway and looked around. The great hall of her clan was gone. The stone pillars that had stood for hundreds of years were cracked and fallen. The carved walls that her ancestors had shaped with their own claws, carving stories and histories into the rock over generations, were blackened and broken. Fire had done some of it. Magic had done the rest. She could still feel the echo of it in the air, a strange and bitter taste that clung to the back of her throat. She stood on 4 legs, then slowly rose onto 2, the way her mother had taught her when she was very young. Standing tall, her mother used to say. Always stand tall. Sera stood tall now, though it cost her something to do it. She looked across the ruins of everything she had ever known and she made herself look at all of it. She did not turn away. Her clan was gone. She knew it before she searched. She searched anyway. She moved through the broken halls and the fallen corridors, stepping over stone and ash and things she did not want to name. She called out once in the old tongue, the deep sound that carried through rock and wind. She waited. Nothing answered. She called again louder and her voice cracked on the second word. She stopped calling after that. She found old Barrack near what had been the eastern chamber. He had been the oldest of them, so old that his scales had gone pale and his eyes had grown cloudy. He had told her stories when she was a hatchling, stories about the early days of the mountain, about the founding of the clan. He was still now, and she stood beside him for a long moment with her head bowed low. She found others. Not many. Enough to know. The war had come fast. That was what nobody had expected. There had been warnings, there were always warnings, but warnings had come before and the danger had always passed. This time it had not passed. This time it had arrived in the night with fire and with power that she still did not fully understand, a force that had torn through their defenses like wind through smoke. She had fought. She had fought with everything she had. It had not been enough. She did not know how she had survived. She could not remember the last hours clearly. She remembered the noise and the heat and then she remembered falling, and then she remembered nothing until the cold woke her this morning. She walked to the edge of the mountain and looked out. The valley below was quiet. The forests and the fields and the distant villages of the humans were all still there, untouched, going on as they always had. The sun was coming up slowly in the east, pale and thin behind gray clouds. Birds were moving in the trees far below. The world down there was simply continuing, the way the world always continued, without any knowledge of what had been lost up here on this peak. Sera sat down on the cold stone at the edge of the cliff. She was the last one. She understood that fully now. There was no one to report to. No one to plan with. No elder to tell her what came next. No young ones to protect or guide. The long line of her clan, stretching back through hundreds of years, had ended here in ash and silence, on a cold morning with a pale sun. She did not cry. Dragon women did not cry easily. But she sat there for a very long time and the wind moved around her and she let it. After a while she stood again. She could not stay here. That much was clear. The ruins held nothing for her now except pain, and staying in pain without purpose was something she refused to do. Her mother had taught her that too. Grief is real, her mother had said. Sit with it. But do not build a home inside it. Sera looked at her damaged wing. She flexed it carefully, testing how far it would open. It would not carry her far. Not yet. But she could walk. She had 4 strong legs and she could walk. She took one last look at the mountain. At the broken halls and the pale ash and the silent stone that had been her home for every day of her life. Then she turned away from it and began to walk down. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she was still alive and that for now that had to be enough. Sera had been walking for 2 days. She did not know exactly how far she had come down from the mountain. The path had been steep and broken in places, and her damaged wing made balancing harder than usual. She had wrapped it close to her body to keep it from catching on branches and rocks, but the pressure of holding it still for so long had made her whole back ache. She had not eaten. She had found a small stream on the first day and drank from it, lying flat on the bank with her face in the cold water, but food had not crossed her mind. Hunger was there, somewhere behind everything else, but grief had a way of pushing smaller things aside. By the second afternoon her legs were starting to shake. She had pulled her tattered cloak tighter around herself as she came closer to the lower lands. She had found it in the ruins, caught under a fallen stone, and it was too short and too torn to cover her properly, but it hid enough. Her wings folded tight. Her tail tucked close. From a distance, in the fading light, she might have looked like something almost ordinary. Almost. The dirt road appeared through the trees without warning. She stopped at the edge of it and looked both ways. It was a simple road, wide enough for a cart, with deep ruts from wagon wheels pressed into the dry earth. There were fields on the other side, flat and open, with rows of something green and low growing in long lines. A farmhouse sat at the far end of the field, small and plain, with smoke coming from the chimney in a thin gray line. Sera looked at the smoke for a moment. She had always been taught to avoid human settlements. Not because humans were evil, her elders had said, but because fear made people dangerous, and humans feared things they did not understand. A dragon woman walking out of the treeline near a village was not a meeting that ended well for anyone. She knew that. She had always known that. But her legs were shaking and the world had gone slightly sideways and she thought she might fall down whether she chose to or not. She made it 3 steps onto the road before she did. She did not fall hard. Her knees hit the dirt first and then she caught herself on her hands, and she stayed there for a moment on all fours in the middle of the road, breathing slowly, telling herself to get up. Her body did not listen. She sat back on her heels and then she simply stopped fighting it and let herself go still. She was still there when she heard the cart. The sound came from down the road, the slow creak of wooden wheels and the steady plod of a horse. She lifted her head and saw a man coming toward her, sitting up on a simple flat cart with a horse pulling it at an easy walk. He was not a large man. He had a plain face, the kind of face that looked like it spent a lot of time outdoors, weathered and calm. He wore a worn brown coat and a hat with a short brim. Sitting beside him on the cart was a small girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with her hair in 2 uneven braids. The man saw Sera and pulled the horse to a stop. There was a long moment where nobody moved. Sera watched him the way she watched everything now, carefully with her body still, ready for whatever came next. She had expected shouting. She had expected him to pull the horse around and go fast in the other direction. She had expected fear, because fear was what she knew humans carried when they looked at her kind. The man climbed down from the cart. He did not run. He did not shout. He walked toward her at the same calm pace he probably used for everything, and he crouched down a few feet away from her and looked at her with steady eyes. Brown eyes, she noticed, tired but not unkind. He said, "You are hurt." It was not a question. She did not answer right away. She was still working out what was happening. He said, "Can you stand?" She said in the common tongue, "I can manage." She could not manage. She tried to prove herself wrong about that and her arms gave way and she caught herself again just before her face hit the road. She heard the small girl make a soft sound of concern from the cart. The man did not make a sound. He simply stood up, went back to his cart, and came back with a large water flask and a folded wool blanket that looked like it normally covered the back of the horse. He set the flask down within her reach and draped the blanket over her shoulders without asking and without touching her more than he had to. He said, "My name is Tom. That is my daughter May. Our farm is just there." Sera said nothing for a moment. She picked up the flask and drank from it and the water was cold and she had not realized until that moment how thirsty she truly was. The small girl May had climbed down from the cart without being told. She walked over and sat down cross-legged in the dirt beside Sera as if this was a perfectly normal thing to do. She reached out and placed her small hand over Sera's large clawed one and just held it there, looking up at her with wide and curious eyes that held no fear at all. Sera looked down at the small hand on top of hers. She had not been touched gently by another living creature since before the mountain fell. She had not known until right now how much that had cost her. Tom said quietly, "Let us get you off the road." Sera did not argue. The barn was warm. That was the first thing Sera noticed when Tom pushed the wide door open and led her inside. It was not a grand warmth, not the deep volcanic heat of the mountain cave she had grown up in, but it was real and steady and it reached through her cold scales in a way that made her close her eyes for just a moment. There was hay on the floor, thick and dry. 2 horses stood in stalls at the far end, and they shifted and snorted when she came in, picking up her scent. She expected them to panic. They did not. They settled after a moment, which surprised her. Animals usually did not settle around her kind. Tom noticed her looking at them. He said, "They are used to strange things. May brings home whatever she finds. Last month it was a wolf pup." Sera said nothing, but she filed that small piece of information away. It told her something about this family. Tom brought a thick pile of old blankets and laid them in the corner furthest from the horses, in a spot where the hay was deepest and the wall blocked the wind. He set a lantern on the wooden beam above and lit it with a match. Then he went to the small iron stove near the barn door, the kind used for warming tools in winter, and got a fire going in it without fuss or ceremony. He did not ask her questions. That was the second thing she noticed. He moved around the barn doing what needed doing, and he did not pepper her with the questions she had braced herself for. "What are you? Where did you come from? What happened to you? Why are you here?" He asked none of them. He just made the space warm and livable, and then he said he would bring food shortly, and he left. May stayed. She sat herself down on a hay bale near Sera's corner and watched her with the same open and fearless curiosity she had shown on the road. She had a small cloth doll in her lap that she turned over in her hands absently while she looked. She said, "Does your wing hurt?" Sera looked at the girl. "Yes." May nodded seriously. "Papa fixes broken wings on birds sometimes. He uses thin sticks and cloth strips." Sera looked at her damaged wing, still folded tight against her back. "I am somewhat larger than a bird." May considered this. "Yes," she agreed. "But the idea is probably the same." Sera did not smile. But something in her chest moved slightly, like a door shifting on a rusty hinge. Tom came back with a wooden bowl of thick stew and a heel of bread and a second lantern. He set it all near her without comment. The stew was simple, root vegetables and something that might have been rabbit, but it was hot and she ate it slowly, and it was the first food she had eaten in 2 days, and it was the best thing she had tasted in longer than she could remember. After May was called inside for bed, the barn grew quiet. Tom stayed. He did not seem to be staying on purpose. He found small tasks to do, checking the horses, mending a piece of harness that was hanging on the wall, turning the stove damper down. But he did not leave, and after a while he settled onto an old wooden stool near the stove and just sat. The fire crackled quietly. After a long silence, Sera said, "I am the last of my clan." She did not plan to say it. It came out the way things came out when a person had been carrying them alone for too long and the weight finally became too much for one pair of hands. Tom looked at her. He did not say he was sorry. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "How many were there?" 43, she said. "Including 4 hatchlings." Tom was quiet again. The fire made its small sounds. One of the horses shifted in its stall. He said, "I lost my wife 2 years ago. Fever. It came fast." He paused. May was 6. She does not talk about it much, but she still sleeps with the blanket her mother made her. Has not let it out of the bed once in 2 years. Sera looked at him. He was not saying it to compare pain. He was not saying it to make her feel less alone in some clumsy way. He was just saying it because she had said something true and he was giving her something true in return. That was all. She said, "It does not get smaller, does it?" He said, "No. You just get bigger around it." She thought about that for a while. The fire burned low and Tom added one more piece of wood without getting up from the stool, just reaching out sideways to the small pile beside him. Outside the wind had picked up and she could hear it moving through the trees beyond the barn wall. She said, "I did not think humans were like this." He looked at her. "Like what?" She said, "Quiet, patient, unafraid." Tom looked back at the fire. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "I have got a farm to run and a daughter to raise and not enough hours in the day for any of it. I do not have room left over for being afraid of things that have not hurt me." Sera looked at her claws resting in the hay. She had lived for over 200 years and she had met kings and warlords and powerful beings of many kinds. None of them had ever said anything that cut as cleanly or as honestly as that. She leaned back against the barn wall and for the first time since the mountain fell she closed her eyes without dreading what the morning would bring. It started with whispers. Sera had been at the farm for 5 days when she first noticed the change. She could not see the village from the barn, but she could hear things, the way she had always been able to hear things that humans could not. Sharp ears were one of the few gifts that had not been taken from her on the mountain. And what she heard, carried on the morning wind from the direction of the village, was her name. Not her real name. The word they were using was creature. And monster. And danger. She said nothing to Tom about it. She did not want to cause him trouble. She had already decided, quietly and without telling anyone, that she would leave soon. Her wing was healing. Tom had done exactly what May had suggested, thin sticks and linen strips bound carefully into place, and it was not elegant but it was working. Another few days and she could travel without risking making the damage permanent. She would leave cleanly before she became a problem. She was still thinking this on the morning the villagers came. She heard them before they reached the gate. A group of them, 8 or 9 by the sound of the footsteps, moving up the dirt road with the particular kind of energy that a crowd carries when it has already made up its mind. She rose from the hay and moved to the barn door and looked through the gap between the old boards. Tom was already outside. She did not know how he had known they were coming, but he was standing in front of his house with his arms at his sides and his face calm, the way his face was always calm, as if nothing in the world could move it very far from center. He was still holding the mug he had been drinking from when they arrived. The man at the front of the group was broad and loud. Sera did not know his name. He had a red face and small eyes and he spoke with the confidence of someone who was used to being agreed with. He said, "Tom, we know what you have in that barn." Tom said, "Good morning, Will." Will said, "Do not good morning me. You have a dragon on your property." "A dragon? With my family not half a mile down the road." Tom took a slow sip from his mug. He said, "She has been here 5 days. Has anything happened?" Will said, "That is not the point." Tom said, "It seems like exactly the point to me." The group behind Will shuffled and muttered. One of them, a woman near the back, said that it was only a matter of time. Another said that creatures like that were not natural this close to the village. Another said that Tom had no right to make that decision for all of them. Tom listened to all of it without interrupting. Then the front door of the house opened and May came out. She had not been called. Nobody had sent for her. She simply came out the way she always did things, directly and without asking permission, and she walked across the yard and stood beside her father. She was small enough that she barely came up to his elbow. She looked at the group of villagers with her mother's eyes, steady and unbothered. Will looked down at her and then back at Tom. He said, "Tom, be reasonable. You have a child to think about." Tom looked down at May and then back at Will. He said, "I am thinking about her right now." Inside the barn Sera stood very still with her eye pressed to the gap in the boards. Her heart was doing something strange. It was not fear exactly. She had felt fear before, real fear, on the mountain in the dark with fire all around her, and this was not that. This was something else entirely and she did not have a name for it yet. She watched Tom stand in his doorway with his daughter at his side and she felt it moving through her chest like warm water. "We'll try it again." He said that the village council had talked. He said that there were rules about things like this. He said that nobody wanted trouble but that Tom was asking for it by harboring something dangerous. Tom said, "Her name is Sera. She is injured and she is healing and she has done nothing to anyone." Will said, "She is a dragon." Tom said, "She is a guest." The word landed quietly but it landed hard. Several of the people behind Will looked at each other. The woman near the back had stopped speaking. Will's red face had gone a slightly different shade, less angry and more uncertain. Tom said in the same even voice he used for everything, "You are welcome to come back when she has actually done something wrong. Until then I would appreciate it if you let me finish my morning in peace." He did not raise his voice once. He did not step forward or make a threat or wave his arms. He simply stood in his doorway and said what was true and waited. Will stood there for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back down the road. The others followed, slowly, the energy of the crowd breaking apart the way a cloud breaks apart when the wind changes. Tom watched them go. Then he looked down at May. He said, "You did not need to come out." May said, "I know." Tom nodded and went back inside. In the barn Sera stepped back from the wall and sat down slowly in the hay. Her hands were shaking slightly, which surprised her. She looked at them for a moment, these large clawed hands that had once been weapons, trembling in the quiet of a warm barn. She had lost 43 members of her clan. She had watched her world burn. She had walked down a mountain alone with nothing left. And somehow it was this, a tired farmer and his small daughter standing in a doorway, that finally broke something open inside her. Not in a painful way. In the way that a window breaks open to let the air in. She sat in the hay and she breathed and she let herself feel, for the first time in days, that she was worth something to someone. It was a small feeling. But it was real. And she held on to it with both hands. The villagers did not come back. A week passed and then another and the road in front of Tom's farm stayed quiet. Will and his group had returned to their lives and their worries and their fields, and whatever fire had brought them up that morning had burned itself out without catching anything. Sera heard the whispers in the village wind grow quieter with each passing day. They did not disappear entirely. They probably never would. But they became background noise, the way distant thunder becomes background noise when it moves on without bringing rain. Sera's wing healed. Tom checked it every morning with the same careful and unhurried attention he gave everything. He would unwrap the linen strips and look at the joint and press gently in certain places and ask if it hurt. She would tell him honestly and he would nod and rewrap it a little differently each time, adjusting as it improved. He never made a fuss about it. He treated it the same way he treated a fence that needed mending or a wheel that needed straightening. Something that needed attention, so he gave it attention. On the 12th day he unwrapped it and looked for a long moment and said, "Try opening it." Slowly. She opened her wings slowly. It spread wide in the barn, filling the space above them, the great dark membrane catching the morning light that came through the high gaps in the roof. The horses did not even look up anymore. She held it open and moved it carefully through its full range, and there was stiffness, but the sharp tearing pain was gone. Tom watched and then he said, "Good." That was all he said. But she had learned by now that Tom's good meant something. It was not a word he threw around loosely. She folded the wing back and said, "I could leave now." Tom picked up the linen strips and began rolling them neatly. He said, "You could." There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable. She said, "The south field. The one with the stone rows. You have not been able to clear it properly." He said, "Been meaning to get to it." She said, "I can move the stones." He looked at her then. Not with surprise exactly. More with the quiet recognition of a man who understood what was being offered and what it meant. He said, "That would help." And that was how it began. She started with the south field, pulling stones from the earth that Tom's single plow horse could never have shifted, stacking them along the border where they would serve as a wall. Her strength was something she had always taken for granted on the mountain, just a fact of her body, unremarkable. Here it was different. Here it meant something practical. She could see it in the way the field opened up, row by row, the dark soil rich and ready underneath. May came out after her morning lessons and watched for a while, and then without asking she began collecting the smaller stones that Sera had loosened, carrying them two at a time to the wall. She was not strong enough to make much difference in practical terms. But she carried every stone with great seriousness, and that made Sera slow her own work slightly so that May's contributions landed at the right moments. After 3 days the south field was clear. Tom stood at the edge of it in the late afternoon light with his hands on his hips and looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Sera. He did not say thank you. She had noticed he rarely did, not because he was ungrateful but because he expressed gratitude differently, in actions rather than words. That evening he made a meal larger than usual, and he set 3 places at the table inside the house instead of leaving a bowl at the barn door. Sera had to fold herself carefully to get through the doorway. May thought this was the funniest thing she had ever seen and laughed until Tom told her gently to settle down, which she did, still smiling into her bowl. It was the first time Sera had eaten at a table with other people in longer than she could remember. She sat in a chair that was too small for her and ate food that was simple and warm, and she listened to Tom and May talk about ordinary things, a hen that had stopped laying, a book May was reading, whether it would rain by the weekend. Small things. The kind of small things that only exist when life is stable enough to notice them. She realized she had not heard small things in a very long time. The songs came later. May had asked about them one evening when they were sitting outside in the cooling air, the 3 of them on the old wooden bench Tom kept along the south wall of the house. May had asked if dragons had music and Sera had said yes, and May had asked what it sounded like, and instead of explaining Sera had simply sung. It was a short song, an old one, the kind sung to hatchlings at night in the mountain caves. It was low and slow, and the words were in the old tongue that no human had ever learned. It moved through the evening air like something physical, like smoke, like warmth. When it ended, May sat very still for a moment. Then she said, "Teach me the words." Sera looked at her. This small human child with her uneven braids and her fearless eyes, asking to carry a dragon song in her mouth. She taught her the words. That night Sera sat in the barn long after the farmhouse had gone dark and quiet. She looked up through the high gaps in the roof at the stars, the same stars she had watched from the mountain peak for 200 years. She had lost her clan. She had lost her home. She had lost the world she was born into, and she had walked away from its ashes with nothing. But somewhere between a dirt road and a south field and a table set for 3, something had been rebuilt. Not the same. Nothing would ever be the same. But real. Solid. Warm in the way that only chosen things are warm. Tom had not offered her a cave or a mountain or a clan. He had offered her something smaller and something greater. A door that opened. A fire in the evening. A child learning her songs. Sera closed her eyes and listened to the quiet farm breathing around her, and she felt, deep in her chest where the grief still lived, something settling gently beside it. Not replacing it. Just keeping it company. She was home.